Source: Billy Edward Albert Meyer, Figu, Sim J. Silver Star Center, 8495 Schmadruti, Switzerland. Translation by Vibke Walder, Australia. Corrections: Vivian Legg, Australia, and Christian Frehner, Switzerland. News about the coronavirus and what is rationally to be considered. According to the information and recommendations of the Plejare Ptaah.
For your information.
In September 2002, in the South Chinese province of Guangdong, the rampantly spreading disease, epidemic SARS, which was not known until then, appeared for the first time. The pathogen of this rampantly spreading disease, epidemic, however, did not exhibit any parasites that can multiply in host cells, such as mycoplasma, that is to say, the tiniest bacteria of the class of mollicutes, which live aerobically, right up to facultative anaerobically. Neither did it exhibit any tiny chlamydiaceae, that is to say gram-negative bacteria, where through no bacterial infection arose, but a virus infection. Therefore, those were not pathogens that cause an atypical lung infection or pneumonia, but a virus. Consequently, antibiotics were not effective for those who were sick with it, which led to many deaths within 2 years, which officially was declared as being a little over 1,000, which in reality however were many more. The unknown virus was then defined as coronavirus of the genus of Coronaviridae, which, in a secret laboratory, mutated from a pathogen of an avian mammal, that is to say horseshoe-nosed bat, Rhinolophae. Even though it is claimed that the origin of the pathogen is unknown and perhaps could have been transmitted by bats, this virus then was described as the SARS-associated coronavirus, SARS-CoV, but abbreviated as SARS or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. Effectively it was not a simple disease, but a rampantly spreading disease, epidemic, which was then also called SARS pandemic. The transmission of the pathogens happened mainly through direct or indirect droplet infection, namely through breath droplets/airborne droplets. Firstly, while speaking, the breath is exhaled as a very fine wisp of droplets. However, during this process the breath becomes visible only on cold days and not on warm days. However, this wisp of breath droplets, as a rule, has the characteristic that it spreads by about half a meter when it is cold and therefore is inhaled by conversation partners that are close to the person speaking, which in this form leads to an airborne droplet infection. Secondly, on cold days the breath condenses out of the mouth and thus the wisp of breath droplets becomes visible and appears as small wafts of mist from the mouth. Thirdly, condensing breath droplets do not only arise from human beings but also from animals and certain creatures. Fourthly, however, with the process of the breath droplets, which, as explained, is only visible on cold days but not on warm days, it is to be considered that it is also exhaled from the mouth while speaking when it is warm and consequently is inhaled by persons standing nearby. Fifthly, the breath droplets of the human being, which must be mentioned again, always become visible when the moist warm exhalation from the mouth meets the cold and moist ambient air. The reason for this is based on the physical characteristic of air, because it can only absorb a certain amount of water vapor and allow it to become visible. Warm air also absorbs moisture, indeed more than cool air, in which case the warm air exhaled from the mouth during warmer temperatures, in contrast to when it is colder temperature, spreads further and at the same time and visibly, namely up to about 1 meter, which corresponds to about the outer limit of the exhalation. Sixthly, the breath droplets of the human being also have a weight, namely at 0 degrees Celsius, U circumflex depending on the person and the cubic meter U circumflex it is about 4.5 U circumflex 4.8 grams, which means about 30 grams at 30 degrees Celsius. The breath droplets, however, also saturate the air, Consequently, it can in this regard also only absorb limited moisture. Seventhly, when the breath droplets cool down further, the breath-water vapor changes such that tiny water droplets arise from the breath, which then float in the air and spread. Eighthly, the breath becoming visible as breath droplets during cool temperatures depends, on one hand, on the ambient temperature, but on the other hand, on the atmospheric humidity. Visible breath droplets can thus only be produced and made visible at a lower temperature, and this also only when the water vapor molecules contained in the exhaled breath condense so quickly that they immediately crystallize as tiny nebulas. Ninthly, an infectious contact can also occur via infected persons that are coughing and sneezing, or by dogs and cats, because also pets can be carriers of the coronavirus. Also, the indirect way of contact infection or smear infection with the virus from items, body surfaces or food on which the infectious airborne droplets have settled, leads to contamination if they subsequently get into the body via the mucous membranes, for example, the mouth, nose or eyes. A transmission via the fecal oral way and other body excretions is also possible, as is transmission via infected animals, creatures and house beetles, such as cockroaches and so forth.
Translated with deepl.com. Source:
Sonderausgabe
8.
Extract from the 729. Official Contact Report of 2nd of January 2020.
Our latest census results of the world's terrestrial population showed at midnight on December 31st a number of exactly 9,60,794,141 or 9,60,794,141 terrestrial people.
So the 9 billion are now exceeded, and within the framework of breeding the overpopulation. As it has been done so far, it will probably continue.
This will be so, because reason will continue to be unresponsive to the terrestrial people, just as it is with the corona plague from China, which is spreading into a pandemic. In particular, the WHO and the powers that be will fail as a result of their stupidity, because they are incompetent leaders who are incapable of judging how the new epidemic will develop in the future. In their arrogance and ignorance of the real situation, they do not realize that the whole thing is already spreading and that completely wrong methods are being used to detect corona disease. As a result, many illnesses and deaths are already not recognized as epidemic diseases, which in the coming months will allow an uncontrollable spread to many other countries, because due to arrogance, self-importance, stupidity and know-it-all attitude of those responsible in politics and governments, the necessary strict measures are not taken to prevent a pandemic. And even if this pandemic, which has long since become fatal, spreads more and more and faster to many other countries, causing the death of many infected and infected people, the stupid state leaders and politicians, as well as doctors and scientists etc., will still not understand that, as a result of their ignorance and inaction regarding the right thing to do, they themselves will be responsible for the expansion of the disease and its effective degeneration into a pandemic. It will be another 2 months from today before all the loudmouths, know-it-alls and self-important politicians, government officials, medical doctors, researchers and scientists start making stupid remarks about the pandemic that has long since taken hold. However, this will not mention the effective danger of the corona disease, because research will not have investigated all the necessary results in this regard, and consequently it will not have been recognized that not only the people on Earth are carriers of the disease, but also their pets, especially cats and dogs. This fact also contributes to the spread of the disease, as well as the fact that research is being carried out laxly, which is why it is not recognized that on the one hand the pathogen is much more infectious than is suspected, but on the other hand it will not be recognized for a long time that the incubation period is not only 14 days but up to 1 month, but can be up to 3 months. In addition, the disease will change over time and in the course of its spread and become more aggressive, which will have the consequence that outside of China or in other countries the disease will spread more intensively and aggressively and also become more deadly, including for Europeans and other countries worldwide. This, while certain carriers will spread the disease further afield, where the disease itself does not break out, but which carry the virus and spread the disease. These can be children and young people in particular, whose immune systems are still full of energy and unaffected, which is why they are hardly or not at all affected by the symptoms of the disease. However, ethnicity must also be taken into account, because the human immune systems differ from nation to nation and are therefore more or less susceptible, which is still completely unknown to medical science on Earth. The ignorance, stupidity and foolishness of those responsible at the WHO, as well as of politicians, leaders and medical professionals, will lead to a very rapid and widespread pandemic spread of the corona disease, which will soon be renamed corona, in the coming months. This, while all the different responsible persons mentioned above will still not recognize the facts of the pandemic and will dull in stupid assumptions. For a long time to come, they will remain under the false and ill-considered, stupid belief that one might develop, but it has already spread. All of them are incapable, which will prove to be to the detriment of many who will die from the disease in the coming months, of foreseeing the effective facts and effects and the worldwide spread of the disease, which is why they will talk like fools and miss everything necessary to prevent the spread of the disease. Their stupid and downright simple-minded speeches, explanations, views and opinions will bring distress, suffering and need, misery and death to a great number of people worldwide, because the epidemic will become more intense, more aggressive and more contagious. As a result, more and more people everywhere will be affected by it, especially the elderly and others who are pre-stressed as a result of a weakened immune system. The stupidity of all those whom I have already mentioned, the fallible leaders of the WHO, as well as politicians, public health officials and state leaders, as well as the doctors etc., who act as medical professionals, and in this respect I am only talking about the fallible ones, are only making big speeches and words in their stupidity, ignorance, pomposity and self-exaltation and are absolutely incapable of assessing the real situation. In their stupidity and ignorance, they even fail to recognize and know that when a disease breaks out in a country and claims lives, it is an epidemic, and that the beginning of a pandemic is already to be judged as such when 100 people die and at least 1 or 3 people are carried away with the disease to another country. In our old chronicles, which are of great importance to us and are therefore often consulted, I have found records in recent days which state that in earlier times, planet-wide epidemics or pandemics had caused great disaster on our worlds. In such a case, we have always acted in such a way that the unavoidable measures were immediately taken and implemented, whereby the outbreak was immediately contained and neutralized in such a way that it could not spread worldwide, or before widespread epidemics or even pandemics could arise. First, very strict isolation of the areas where contagious disease or pandemic has occurred was carried out by hermetically sealing off the areas concerned, together with a blockade of entry and exit for all persons without exception until the disease or pandemic had been terminated. This would also have to be introduced, implemented and maintained in this way in all states on Earth, because only through such a measure can an epidemic or even a pandemic be prevented. In our chronicles, it is almost 47,000 years since epidemics and pandemics were last recorded on our worlds, because, as I explained, isolation was the way to act. When, in the event of an epidemic, comprehensive territorial isolation and a total, all-embracing, total blockade of all forms of entry and exit is imposed and implemented. This has nothing whatsoever to do with fear, panic or hysterical behavior, but is merely an act of sensible and reasonable security to prevent an epidemic or pandemic. If the Earth human leaders of the WHO, governmental and medical authorities, research, health authorities, disease control, etc., are carefully analyzed in terms of their sense of responsibility for their medical and safety knowledge, it is alarming to see and to note that all of them are still very disadvantageously backward, ignorant, misjudging, arrogant, magniloquent and autocratic in these important areas. This state of affairs also does not allow them to take the right measures in advance, which inevitably leads to epidemics and pandemics. Failure to take the right measures therefore leads to exactly what should be avoided, namely the spread of diseases and epidemics, which inevitably leads to fear, panic and hysteria among the population. However, acting rationally and rationally in the face of an epidemic prevents all fear, panic and hysteria from the outset, precisely when responsible action is taken by acting correctly and taking the right protective measures. Irresponsible thought, behavior and the correspondingly incorrect assessments and the inability to make appropriate predictions are evidence of the absolute inability of those responsible to make decisions and manage the safety, leadership and health of the people entrusted to their care. This means, however, that these aforementioned leaders are nothing more than charlatans who only want to speak out and make themselves big, to shine in their arrogant self-portrayal and to make themselves irreplaceable and important, for which, in their unfitness, they are still willing to pay high financial rewards. To say this once, has been in my mind for a long time, because the whole fuss, action and pseudo-logic as well as the pompous behavior of the majority of these people on earth, who as politicians and leaders of the state have to bear and fulfill a great deal of responsibility, seems to me like the thoughtless and incomprehensible behavior and thinking of ungrown play children, their lack of understanding and reason, as well as their complete inability to think ahead, to foresee and to foresee, as well as to decide in advance, is so precariously absolutely void that they are in every respect incapable of making and carrying out correct decisions. In summary, all the offices of operation that they hold do not in any way correspond to the responsibility that they should bear and fulfill. This is because they lack all the necessary ability to think and make decisions, and thus lack the clear thinking and use of reason, and are therefore stupid in this respect. In this way, it is impossible for them, in their illogicality and as a result of emerging false intuitions, to grasp logical and foresighted thought processes, because these are alien to all clear understanding and all clear reason and therefore do not fit together. This means that they are consequently incapable of making clear, correct and valuable decisions and implementing them. But it also says that they lack rationally all ability to bring about clear thoughts and considerations, because their intersection of the recognition of facts and the ability to make the necessary decisions and take the right measures is set as low as it is in our descendants at the age of 6 years. From this point of view, it must be said that, also from a psychological point of view, our young descendants and the terrestrial human beings mentioned above, such as politicians and leaders of states and many other persons responsible to the terrestrial populations of which I have just spoken, meet worlds that could not be more blatant.
You are aroused, dear friend, it is obvious.
That is so, yes, because the entire responsible persons, around whom our conversation revolves, are less well off in their intellect, in their wrong behavior, in their inability to make decisions and in their capacity to act and thus in the use of reason, than our 12-year-old descendants.
I guess you are right about that, which is why I can feel and understand your excitement. On the one hand, these importantly thinking, wrongly sprung earthlings want to be in their megalomania sober, number-oriented understanding people, and on the other hand they want to be intuitive and also communicative feeling people, which in truth corresponds neither in the one nor in the other case to reality, and compared to it a discrepancy unparalleled. Thus, there is a general disproportion and incongruity and contradiction between their rationality and reality, which means that they completely lack an understanding and reason-guided and purpose-oriented way of thinking, which means that they cannot make any rational decisions and thus cannot implement any. This also applies to the speech and actions of these persons, so also with regard to their statements and the facts they would have to judge, which is rationally impossible for them. This is also the reason why the potential for them to fail to recognize and understand real reality and its existing facts, as well as for misunderstandings and complications, is correspondingly great and in part even immeasurable. In this respect, the whole thing begins with the central question of what is important in order to think, consider and conceive appropriate, necessary and correct measures, and thereby to conceive and bring about far-reaching changes. Basically, these people have no intuitive intuition, nor do they have a good and intentional communication with people who are knowledgeable about the subject matter, which means that they cannot present any sober facts or hard measurements. As a result, they always arrive at the wrong alternatives, from which they are unable to make a correct, valuable and tangible choice in order to make the right decision and act accordingly. If everything is looked at and analyzed carefully, then the whole corresponds to the Western tradition of thought, accordingly to the intellect, reason and Western thinking culture, as well as to the emotional state, whereby rationality and emotionality are seen as opposites, which is not correct, because from this point of view some people are rather rationally inclined, while others are rather emotionally inclined. In my opinion, the entire Western way of thinking corresponds to a serious thinking trap, because the way I judge the whole thing, a completely wrong way of thinking is cultivated, which inevitably leads to wrong conclusions. If logical thinking is done, then the rational logically corresponds exactly to the opposite of the emotional and thus forms a
irrationality.
The opposite of emotional therefore does not correspond to a rationality, but to a state of emotionlessness. If, therefore, these two factors are contrasted with each other, then a suggestion takes place that irritates the mind and the rational thinking and the feelings arising from it, and also influences the psyche accordingly. Of course, it is possible that a very well-founded rational, emotional view and an attitude can be good, or a passionate standpoint can be taken. However, it is also possible that a thoughtlessness breaks through and consequently no emotions are created, which then results in completely irrational events, incidents, procedures, actions, verbal expressions and occurrences, incidents, events or affairs, etc.
You were a very good student of my father, because even as a boy you were very well versed in psychology.
That's probably not half as bad, but sometimes I find it alarming how our earthly psychologists act up and think that they have fed their dubious wisdom with shovels, but in reality hardly understand anything of the rational. But that is not surprising here on Earth, just with the earthlings, and not only in terms of psychology, but also with regard to other things, such as, for example, that worldwide conflicts between states and in their populations themselves have increased blatantly and continue to increase more and more, because psychological rivets are bumbling around as state leaders and maneuvering humanity into misery and ruin. This is especially the case with regard to many malicious political machinations that could not be more warmongering and peace-threatening, as the USA in particular has always been doing, and for some time now Trump has also been doing, and idiotically inciting Russia, together with the EU dictatorship and Germany in particular. All around, acts of war of various kinds are being instigated, such as civil wars, sectarian terror wars, murders of people going mad, deadly terrorist acts by individual terrorists, organized mass murders, secret service murders and political assassinations, etc. The depravity of many earthlings is becoming more and more prevalent, and consequently inexorably many different forms of degeneration and inhumanity are becoming more and more frequent and rampant. This, together with the more and more spreading stupefaction of countless earthlings, who vegetate around with app and digitalism brains and slowly but surely go dumb. On top of all this comes the whole refugee misery, which will continue far into the future and already starts again in Syria and Afghanistan, as you have already said several times, for which the German Chancellor Merkel is responsible, who should actually be held accountable. This, as in Syria Assad and in Turkey Erdogan, both of whom are dictatorial state criminals.
Unfortunately, this is indeed the case, and in the near future there will be new large waves of refugees. As you just said, the big refugee rush is already beginning and will soon be coming from Syria to Europe, as our forecasts show. On the one hand, the Syrian dictator Assad, with his war machinations, will drive his own people out of the country, while on the other hand, the sectarian Turkish presidential dictator Erdogan, who has seized power by vicious underhandedness, will also play his part. As he did at the beginning of his fraudulent takeover, he will long for riches and force the EU dictatorship and Germany to comply with him by demanding billions of euros. So he will blackmail the EU dictatorship, open the national borders for refugees and try to pave the way to Europe for them with police and military aid, which will cause a lot of refugee misery and create big problems for the EU dictatorship and its member states, as our forecasts make clear. Just as the rulers of the EU dictatorship exercise their malicious power, so do many other rulers and politicians around the world who are not worthy of their office and should have no right to misgovern the world and humanity from one misery and from one misery to another misery and to another misery, as has happened since time immemorial throughout the history of humanity on Earth, is happening now and will continue to happen for a long time in the future. Unfortunately, however, the peoples of all states are themselves so stupidly stupid and populist-hearted that any power-hungry, sense of idiots of both sexes are cheered up into politics and governments and are put at the helm of the state with the help of the stupidity of the peoples. There they can then take over and rule until the devil come out, as you once said, to conjure up endless terror, to which the stupid, dumb and sneaky peoples must submit.
It's amazing how you're slowly using more and more of my words, comparisons, and ways of expressing things, so that sometimes it all seems to me as if I'm talking what you're saying out of you.
Slowly I am learning that your statements and speeches about various problems, attitudes and degenerations etc., of the Earth people in general, as well as especially with regard to politicians and state leaders etc., cannot be brought up with mendacious, hypocritical diplomatic phrases, but only with clear and open words as you use them.
How right you are, dear friend. But if you'll allow me,